welcome all of you. I'm so thrilled and pleased to see everybody gathering today and to have this wonderful event finally occurring. It's been a long road, and it's been a wonderful time every step of the way. In November 2010, for the first time in 175 years, descendants of all three of John Burgwyn's family lines gathered in Wilmington for a spectacular first reunion. During that event, cousin Jimmy Lockhart presented a beautiful framed award to Tony Cooley for his role in bringing about the first wonderful Burgwyn reunion. Tonight, as we begin the 2013 reunion, I would like to follow in Jimmy's footsteps. I did everything but call myself adjutant. And I would like to recognize George Pollock Burgwyn for his wonderful leadership and for his role as the chairperson of the 2013.
Co-chair.
Oh no. I would like George to come forward, and on behalf of the entire family, I would like to present him with this award and to offer our thanks for a job well done. As I said, I cribbed mightily from Jimmy. And Tom, I hope you will tell him that he was supposed to be here to help take the honor for this. But it says, to all and sundry, descendants of John Burgwyn of Wilmington, North Carolina, in reunion, assembled in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on September 27th, 8th, and 9th, 2013, do hereby express the gratitude of the entire family to George Pollock Burgwyn IV of Warrenton, Virginia, for his chairmanship of the 2013 Reunion Committee and his dedication to ensuring that the three branches of the family continue to gather and to celebrate our collective heritage. His knowledge and interest in the life and experiences of the Burgwyn family during the Civil War has culminated in this second Burgwyn family reunion. In witness hereof, having been duly authorized to do so, I hereby set my seal and hand this 27th day of September 2013. And I'm not the adjutant.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
What a wonderful surprise. And I have some stories on Elizabeth that are planned in later remarks. And I'll give you the secret. I intend to give you the secret of how you somehow receive one of these things totally unexpected. Now, thank you so much, Elizabeth, and to the rest of the committee, and for all you gathered. The bar will continue to be open until we are asked to leave at approximately 10 p.m. And I'm going to be asking the invocation and blessing of the present so we can go ahead and begin our wonderful meal. During the invocation, I will be recognizing members of the family who have departed this life since our last reunion. And I'm also going to invite any and all of you to join in that petition If you have anyone that you would like to state either aloud or silently, this would be the opportunity to recognize someone and remember someone that we love and who's no longer with us, but who we know would certainly thrive at these proceedings. Will you please bow your head with me? Let us pray together. Let us offer thanks for the blessings of this beautiful day and for the occasion that has brought our family safely together from such great distances. Let us give thanks for the legacy of our family members who have departed this life since our last reunion. Margaret Blair Burgwyn, George Burgwyn Holmes, Margaret Elizabeth Burgwyn Cooley, John Ormsby Willard, Mary Virginia Barrow Burgwyn, and all others we now name silently or aloud. Emily Roper Burgwyn Sneed, George Pollock Burgwyn III, Bartlett Roper Burgwyn, and the twins, Nathaniel Thomas Ridley Burgwyn and Collison Pierpoint Edwards Burgwyn. We give thanks for the legacy of our family members who lived, served, fought, suffered, and died in our nation's tragic Civil War 150 years ago. For their legacy is present here and now in this room in both body and spirit. Let us ask for blessings for all members of our family, for the food we are about to receive, and for the hands that have prepared it. May this meal in pleasant company nourish and sustain us, and may we ever be mindful of the needs of others. Amen.
Enjoy your meal.
Grandmother, as we called her, the Quaker lady at the candle with the stack of books that we've all seen, I think. If you haven't come to my room, I've got like 18 pictures and books. My wife's a little embarrassed what we put them in the hotel room, but anyway, it's 3:04. I'm not saying it's a party. I'm just saying it's but the in her book, she wrote, in her diary, and I have a diary with me, it's about this thick, single spaced. If you haven't heard, the Burgwyn Wright House Museum is scanning, digitizing, and editing that diary so that it's immediately accessible and searchable to any of us, because it's pretty daunting, a stack of paper like that. So anyway, they're putting it into a form that we can all actually really use, which was really sweet of them.
What was her name?
Caroline Burgwyn Clitheroe, her married name. So Caroline writes this diary. Well, correct me now. Yeah, okay. I'm expecting some correction because that's the point of this long toast. Sorry. Anyway, in Caroline's diary, she writes, "And here I sit in 1848, as if to say in modern 1848, and I hold in my hand a letter that my father courted my mother with. And she said, I sit here with the joy knowing that my grandchildren will read this. 1848. She is marveling that her grandchildren might be aware that she's holding that letter. Okay, and here we are tonight. So, my toast is about the people that do this weird thing of keeping track of family history. And it would have to start, and I'm going to miss some people. I'm new to this family, remember, I'm only 3 years into this thing. So I'll of course have to say Caroline Burgwyn Clitheroe and Walter Burgwyn Jones, who wrote the family, the book that most of us refer to, and a lot of that was taken from Caroline's diary. And I'll mention him a little bit tomorrow. You have to mention him. You have to mention Tillman. You have to mention Elizabeth. King. John Fanning. Steve Burgwyn, who, when I went to their house, he showed me the original, what do they call them when they first type out a book, whatever that is.
Manuscript.
The manuscript for the boy Colonel, who we are in large part, among others, we're here to honor, and it's sitting right in their home. So it's to all of those, including people who bother to take the time and money to come out and do this sort of thing. You know, my toast is to all those ancestors that live lives that are worth remembering, and to those that bother to remember. Hear, hear. You may proceed with it.
Here they can explain the difference about the why issue. But anyway, so in my family, the great family dinners that were held at the Burgwyn house, Cousin Elizabeth, my house, there were Sunday dinners, there were great events where there were parades coming up and down the street. We decorated our bikes and everything. We all got together. There was always a toast that the older generation gave to each other. We were pretty small back then. We didn't always understand what this stuff meant, but there was a lot of red-faced dads giving this toast back and forth, back and forth. I think only in as much as that the glass could be raised at each toast presentation. But here goes the toast. It's the Burgwyn toast, without the lie. May you live long and prosper.
I look towards you and likewise bow.
Yes.
Here, here.
Here, here. So we all look towards you.
And likewise.
Thank you.
Relatively appropriate for this meeting. It hung on the wall of my home when I was growing up, and I suspect many of these southern groups that are here now. It goes like this. Here's to the land of the long-leaf pine, the summer land where the sun doth shine, where the weak grows strong and the strong grows straight. Here's to down home, the old North State. Here's to North Carolina.
Participated in vows of Gettysburg and Antietam today. But before we move on to my volunteers, they're going to tell us all about them. We're going to get caught up by family history from the time of John Burgwyn's death until the Civil War. And who better to catch us up on that than our family historian, Tillman Ford. Tillman's going to come up and just little catch up.
Thank you, John. A couple of weeks ago, I asked John to find out what he had planned. He didn't mind giving me a couple of minutes to accomplish two goals. One was to congratulate the team that put this effort together on behalf of the team that put the previous effort together. We've kind of already done all that, so I'm not going to worry about that so much now. I will make one comment though. You can't expect anything but perfection from a team that includes people named for my great-grandfather, my great-great-great-grandfather, and my great-great-great-great-grandmother. So I expected good work. They did good work. My second goal was to bridge the gap between the time of John Burgwyn, which we learned all about in Wilmington, and what I consider the zenith of the Burgwyn family's history south of the Mason-Dixon line at the time of the Civil War. We'll be focusing on that later time in today's talk today. I'm going to be talking just a little bit about the time between John Burgwyn's death and the Civil War time, which includes some of the most fantastically interesting people you can imagine. But before I do that, I want to step back a little bit in time. I want to step back a long way in time. 200 million years ago, the great supercontinent of Pangaea began to break apart along a line just east of what we now call the Appalachian Mountains. That rift ultimately failed, but it did create a number of small basins along the eastern seaboard of what's now North America. Those basins extend from the Bay of Fundy in Canada all the way down to Wadesboro, North Carolina, the birthplace, I believe, of Tom Walker. Nonetheless, we are in one of those basins. Those basins were filled with soft sedimentary rock and hard igneous rocks. Now, I can see that some of y'all are thinking, I hope we didn't come all the way up here to listen to Tim give some boring talk on geology. Well, if that's the way you feel about it, I just want to let you know that you're not alone. Harry Burgwyn, in his BMI textbooks on natural philosophy, which is what they called physics and geology back in those days, his textbook is full of doodles in the margins of the text. He was writing down his people in his cadet class, girls' names, trying his name in a lot of different ways, writing poetry, just all kinds of stuff that indicated he was extremely bored during the subject. However, geology is still important. If Harry had had a crystal ball, he would have been able to see that those hard igneous rocks in this basin were named by the early settlers things like Culp Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Big and Little Round Tops, and as we saw this morning, the Confederates always seemed to be going uphill. They were going uphill along those igneous rocks. Now, that's enough about geology. Back to the family history. When John Burgwyn died in 1803, his children, which remember were from his second marriage, were very young. John was 20, Caroline was 19, George William Bush was 15. Now, John had finished his education, as had Caroline, in England. They had come back a couple of years previously, and John was familiar enough with his father's work as both a planter and a merchant shipper to take over his father's business. Caroline had finished her education also in England. She came back in the following year, actually before her father died. She had fallen in love with a doctor from South Carolina and married, and was in the process of starting her own family when her dad died. George William Bush was off at school at the University of North Carolina. I'm going to take each one in turn. John Fanning Burgwin took over his father's business, and then 3 years after his father died, he met and married a woman named Sarah Pierpont Hunt from Newburgh, North Carolina, but they married in Saratoga Springs, New York. Tells you a little something about the social life of the family in those days. That turned out to be a really, really good choice for the family. Miss Sarah Hunt was the granddaughter of the famous New England preacher Jonathan Edwards. She was the daughter of John's daughter Eunice. And Eunice had previously married Thomas Pollock III, one of the richest men in North Carolina. He subsequently died, and she had remarried Mr. Hunt and had the Sarah. Now, I think Sarah Hunt connects us to the most interesting guy in the family connection history. She was first cousin of the former Vice President Aaron Burr. I like Aaron Burr. He was a really arch rival of Thomas Jefferson, came this close to being President of the United States. And in those days, if you didn't get elected president, the second guy was the vice president. Think about what politics would be like today if that was the way the system worked. Aaron Burr, in case you had forgotten, probably best known for a guy as the guy who killed that bastard whose picture is on the $10 bill. And I use the term literally because he was illegitimate. Burr, although the duel that he fought with Hamilton was a couple of years before John and Sarah got married, I feel sure they visited him in New York. He lived till 1836. They would have visited him in New York on their many trips when they went up there. The great event in our family's history occurred in 1837 when Sarah's half-brother died. He was George Pollock. George Pollock was reportedly the richest man in North Carolina and the handsomest man in North Carolina. When he died, he had never married, had no children, died intestate. So the heirs of his full sister decided the land and all the fortune really belonged to them, not so much their half-sister Sarah. So John Fanning's children, particularly the headstrong Henry King Burgwyn Sr., raised the familiar Burgwyn battle cry, "We'll see you in the courthouse." And we did. And we won. And we were declared rightful heirs to half of the Pollock fortune. That put us all in the land in the Northampton County, and most of you know the history that follows that, so I'm not going to go into that. The second of John Burgwyn's children was Caroline. Caroline, as I mentioned before, had married in 1802 a doctor who originally was from Charleston named George Campbell Clitheroe. Dr. Clitheroe's father was also a doctor. His name was James Clitheroe. I didn't know much about him, but one of his descendants, Michael Denton, sitting down here, had come across a transcript of James Clitheroe, the elder, diary. And in July of 1776, important time, he reported being in Philadelphia and visiting with certain General George Washington. And he described meeting General Washington, coming back from some discussions he had, as getting unbent and very affable. Unbent means he was probably having a drink and relaxing in the afternoon. I love that terminology. The things In Caroline's case, things were not quite as fortunate economically. Her share of her father's fortune basically got spent up before her husband died in 1829. Caroline was a very well-educated woman, so she opened girls' schools in both Smithville, which is now called Southport, North Carolina, and in New Bern. And in 1837, she moved with a number of her children to Alabama, and that group continued on in that line. Now, whereas John Fanning had 8 children, 5 of whom survived until adulthood, Caroline had 9 children, 6 of whom survived until adulthood. The next child, and the youngest child, George William Bush Burgwin, who was born just a month before his mother died, and was 15 when his father died, basically he had been raised in America, unlike his siblings. They were both raised in England. He'd been raised in America with his father, so he knew all about the plantations and how to manage it. He started out basically taking over at the Hermitage in Wilmington, but he met and married, in another good choice, a woman named Maria Nash. Maria Nash happened to be the daughter of the second governor of the state of North Carolina, Governor Abner Nash. Abner Nash was well connected. His brother was Francis Nash, who was a general in the Revolutionary War and killed in the Revolutionary War, and for whom Nashville, Tennessee, and other Nash places are named. Mariah's brother, Frederick, was Chief Justice of the state of North Carolina. Really well-known lawyer, and in fact, her nephew, her son, Gilbert, went later on studied with his uncle Frederick. Now that connects us to another interesting guy, who's much later in the family history, but in case you didn't know, there's a really well-known humorist named Frederick Ogden Nash, who was a very popular TV personality when I was young, and I used to watch him. And my mama would say, "You're kin to him." He's the one that came up with one of my favorite sayings of all time, that candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. Anybody ever uses that statement to you, you've got to understand, what are your relatives make? The family of George William Bush Burgwyn and Maria included 11 children. So now think of this. John Burgwyn's 3 children had a total of 29 children. Not all survived to adulthood, but many, many of them did. I always thought in the days before television and radio, what people did on dark, dreary nights was, I think, responsible for very, very large families that they had in those days. So that's a thumbnail sketch. All 3 kids had done well. Some had done better than others, but no, they all had done well. They were well educated. Their children were well educated. They were substantial members of their societies, both in North Carolina and in Alabama. 2 of the kids our later kids, grandkids of John Burgwyn, had moved to Pennsylvania. John Fanning's daughter, Sarah Emily, was in Philadelphia, and in, I think, 1851, his grandson, Nathaniel Hill Burgwyn, had moved to Pittsburgh. The zenith of the family history south of the Mason-Dixon line occurred before the Civil War. The group north of the Mason-Dixon lines came after the Civil War. They were parts of the so-called Gilded Age, and that's a whole different story, and Elizabeth will tell you some more about that. I hope you've enjoyed that little sketch. I really appreciate all of y'all being here. I would like to encourage you to try to think about these people. As I was thinking this morning, They were just folks like us. I mean, we got their genes in us. We're little parts of many of them. And if you think of them as just people like us, I think you get a much better appreciation of everything that they were feeling during the times that we're going to be talking about when the family was undergoing just a terrible cataclysm in the history of this country. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to John Fanning.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was an excellent synopsis. Question?
Not a question, but a recognition. I think Tillman got a generous contribution of those genes, because he just spoke all of that with no notes and no teleprompter. Tillman, my hat's off to you.
You've noticed that we have a little slideshow projection today, and there's another special slideshow coming later. Just wanted to thank all the contributors to these shows. These pictures came from far and wide, all over the country, over the internet. Some of it requires some travel, we'll go get them. And these family photos have never been all together at one time. Some of them have been in hiding, and some of you have never seen them before. So, again, thank you to all the contributors. They're listed in your reunion booklet to all these photos. You notice that they're all Confederates. We tried to find some Yankees. We would have wondered what had led them astray if we had found any, but we would have honored them just the same, regardless. We're going to cover, again, 5 family members today, emphasize 5 family members that participated in the Battle of Gettysburg and Antietam. 2 generals, a colonel, and 2 captains. I'm going to cover them in order of the battle they were in and when they arrived on the battlefield. And that would be Battle of Antietam came before Gettysburg, and General George Burgwyn Anderson was the first of our family to arrive on that field. And we are fortunate today to have a Burgwyn that lives in Pittsburgh, but somehow had some Confederates sneak into her attic. She has got a treasure trove of letters, personal letters, written by General Anderson. And to my knowledge, no professional historian has ever seen these letters. So nobody knows the general in this world on a personal level as well as Elizabeth Burgwyn.
Good afternoon. I had originally intended to present all the facts and the details of George Burgwyn Anderson's life. But on Tuesday night, following an email that I received during the day, which put the fear of God in me, and at the urging of my sisters, I decided to revise everything. I'm going to begin with only the briefest of facts. And then I'm going to share with you something that is, I think, precious and has not been discussed with anybody. You're the first. George Burgwyn Anderson was the eldest son of William E. Anderson and Frances Eliza Burgwyn, the grandson of George William Bush Burgwyn and Mariah Nash, and the great-grandson of John Burgwyn and Eliza Bush. He was born on April 12, 1831, near Hillsborough, and he died on October 16, 1862, in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was a very well-educated man, and he demonstrated marked intellectual abilities from the youngest ages. In 1847, he entered the University of North Carolina at the age of 16. In 1848, he was appointed as a cadet in the United States Military Academy at West Point. He ultimately graduated 10th in his class of 43 cadets, and that was in the class of 1852. George Burgwyn Anderson was assigned immediately after his graduation to frontier duty. And with his regiment, he witnessed the civil strife and the violence in Kansas and Utah, Nebraska, and he was also involved in what came to be known as the Mormon War. Then in 1859, he was assigned to duties in Louisville, Kentucky. And while there, he met and he married Mildred Butler Ewing, my great-great-grandmother. It is unclear when George and Mildred met, but their courtship and their very, very touching letters began during his early frontier service and continued until his death. Mildred and George married on November 8, 1859, and had 2 children, Ewing Anderson and George Burgwyn Anderson, Jr. On April 25th, 1861, just 13 days after the Battle of Fort Sumter, George Burgwyn Anderson resigned his commission in the United States Army, and subsequently he was among the very first of the old Army who offered his sword and his services to North Carolina. During the Civil War, the 4th North Carolina was present in the support at the Battle of Williamsburg. However, the regiment's first real action came at Seven Pines. Anderson's display of courage and leadership prompted President Jefferson Davis to promote him to Brigadier General on June 9th, 1862. His brigade then fought at the 7 Days Battle and at Malvern Hill, where he was wounded in the hand. The brigade's next battle was at South Mountain, and then on September 17, 1862, Anderson's brigade fought in the Sunken Lane at Antietam. The fight for the Bloody Lane had not been raging very long before General Anderson went down with a smashed ankle. The wound was very painful, but did not appear to be serious. The examining physician concluded that a fragment of shell had hit his foot and glanced off. Only later did a more thorough physician discover a mini ball buried deep inside the wound. Anderson then faced the exhausting and very dangerous ordeal of a wagon trip to Staunton, and then from there by train to Raleigh. Only when he arrived in Raleigh did his personal physician discover the mini ball buried deep inside the wounded joint. Infection and amputation followed, and General Anderson died on the morning of October 16th, 1862. Those are the facts of General Anderson's life, but they do not really provide a very meaningful sense of who that man was. Now, some of the story behind this is that my daddy, Pierce Butler Carlisle Burgwyn Jr., taught me his deep, deep love of family history, and he also left me a number of treasured family artifacts. Among them was an ancient old trunk filled with pictures and maps, Confederate money, a billfold, engraved military belt buckle. Some of you may remember it from Wilmington. One epaulet, a lock of hair, military appointments, including the one that is on the table, and his orders There's an order that I just discovered from General Hill that I couldn't even transcribe, it was so badly written. And in addition to all of those very precious items was a collection of all the personal correspondence between George Burgwyn Anderson and his wife, my great-great-grandmother, Mildred Butler Ewing Anderson. Their correspondence spans the time of their courtship and their marriage, the birth of their first child, military battles, military politics, and it ends with his death. They were all in the trunk. The letters provide a remarkable insight into the man. His deep and passionate love for his wife and his child, his love for his family and his home, his knowledge of art and literature, his love of languages, and all his hopes and dreams for the future. He writes eloquently and beautifully about all of them. I would now like to shift my presentation and allow the General to speak for himself. And I'm working with paper because I want to get these quotes correct. In a letter written just before the birth of baby Ewing Anderson on September 16, 1861, he writes, "You need not think you will have Cousin John Sim to listen to for the long evenings this winter. You will have somebody or somebodies that will engross you to the exclusion of all cousins and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. One of these bodies, I doubt not, will be interesting to you for its novelty. Whether this other will have become stale and unprofitable from long use, modesty forbids me to express an opinion. My precious, I can hardly write to you today. I feel in such a state of suspense and expectation. You shall never be far away from me again at such a time if I can possibly help it. Never, never. I am full of hope and expectation, my precious wife. I love you so very much. How I long to see you and hold you in my arms. Cheerful and hopeful, my darling." And as a little sidebar, Captain John Sim would have been about 18 at the time, and he was kin on the Anderson and the Cameron side. In another letter, he writes, "I love you only too deeply for my own happiness, but I think of all the times when my love will be a source of greater happiness than I have ever yet known. God grant that that happy time will come very soon. I kiss you, my darling, and I hold you close to my heart." In a third, he writes, "My darling, I am vexed and hungry for the want of the food which habitually sustains all my life that is not gross and earthy. Instead of being reconciled to my absence from you, I feel it more and more as time passes by. And I am more and more dependent upon your letters for what little contentment I possess until we meet again." On May 24th, he writes again, "You may accept this assertion for what it is worth, my darling, but it is simply true that as time advances, it brings no healing on its wings from the pain of parting and the absence from you. I love you more and more every day of my life. Every day I feel more and more keenly that your love and your society are necessary to the happiness, nay, to the endurance of my life." On September 18, 1861, he sent a telegram 2 days after the birth of baby Ewing. "Dispatch just received. I thank God for his goodness. I will start immediately to see General Beauregard 12 or 14 miles distance. I will dispatch again tomorrow morning. or tonight if possible. Telegraph me every day how you are until you hear definitely from me. On April 23rd, he writes, I think the baby's likeness is lovely, my darling, and wonderfully well taken for so young and so mercurially a gentleman. I never tire of looking at it. But speaking of youth, he is growing quite old. A week ago, he was 7 months old. I would not be at all surprised if he does begin to talk very soon. On May 27, 1862, he writes of a visit that he and Mildred had and of his concern about the compromised health of baby Ewing. I got 2 dispatches today, my darling. One saying that our little boy was worse, and the other that you had arrived and he was better and very playful. How sincerely, how deeply thankful I am that you got off when you did and got through without delay and found him better. I cannot tell you, my precious, I feel that the worst, the most terrible contingency we faced is safely past, and I will try to hope for the best as cheerfully as possible. God bless his dear, dear little heart. How you must have loved him, my darling, as you held his poor little body in your arms. Sadly, baby Ewing only lived to be a little over a year. He was terribly frail and seriously ill for most of his life, and he was a constant worry to his parents. They write about him in every letter. On August 24th, from a camp along the North Anna, he writes, General Hill has been reassigned to our division and arrived and took command this morning. I don't know whether to be glad or sorry for it. If we could have been certain of retaining General Smith, of course I would have preferred him. But he was liable to be taken from us at any time to be assigned to some higher command. And whenever that occurred, we might have been thrown into worse hands than General Hill's. I have some serious objections to him, and in some respects, I like him very much. I have one advantage in being under him, that he likes me, and I can be sure of getting my full dues on all occasions. He had a pleasant time with his family while he was in Petersburg, having a nice house out of town and his family with him. But he says he has a great deal of anxiety on account of his youngest child and does not expect it to live. We have a report here today of a great battle having occurred yesterday in the neighborhood of Warrenton and are anxiously awaiting news of that result. It is not positively certain that there was a general engagement, but persons who came this morning from Rapidan Station say that yesterday they heard the most horrific cannonading in the direction of Warrenton and extending along a line so long as to make it seem as the whole army was engaged. It is known that our army was following Pope up vigorously on his retreat, so that the supposition is not an improbable one. I hope and trust we have had a victory, but if we have, I doubt not that it has been a bloody one. And I am glad for your sake that I was not in it. You positively make me a coward, my darling. Of course, I would not do anything to keep out of a fight, but I assure you that I am very willing not to be in one until you have passed your trouble and are out of all danger. We have a most excellent camp here, and all other things being equal, I would not object to remaining here long enough to have my conscripts well drilled and set up for field service. All the regiments are camped in pine groves or nice dry pine straw, the ground sloping and well drained. The springs are fresh, cool water, abundant and convenient. Then we are within 300 or 400 yards of the North Anna River, a bold, pretty stream with most excellent bathing places, which I make the men use. Though of course most of them don't need much making. Mackin and myself have been bathing twice and enjoyed it hugely. By sending out of camp 3 or 4 miles, we have managed to get chickens, ducks, vegetables, eggs, butter for our mess. So it is plainly to be seen that we're living well. We could have ice by sending a mile or 2 for it. A farmer who has an ice house, a farmer who has an ice house full, having offered to let us have it. But we have actually cared too little to send for it. How I wish I could send it to you for our little baby. Bless his little heart. The weather has been very pleasant ever since we have been here. Today, some thin-blooded individuals go so far as to say it's too cool. But to me, the temperature is delightful. On September 4th, he writes, "My precious wife, we have had a very fatiguing and uncomfortable march, pressing on all the time to get up in time for the battle. But you will be grieved to know that we failed in this and that the grand victory was achieved without our aid. We are now within 3 miles of the Potomac and start this morning on an expedition which I have no doubt is to cross the river, though I have not been told so." On September 5th, from a camp near the Potomac, opposite Burgwyn, Maryland, the next letter is written just 12 days before Antietam. He writes, "We started off from Leesburg this morning, my darling, on an exhibition to fire across the Potomac at the trains on the Baltimore and Ohio River as they passed through the village of Berlin opposite us. We got here at 2 this afternoon, my brigade and a battery of artillery placed under my charge. But no trains have passed by, although it is past 9 at night. I have just gotten a dispatch from General Hill, directing me to join him tomorrow at another point on the river. So I am afraid that I will not have an opportunity of interfering with the Yankee travelers this time. General Hill has crossed the river, however, with the other brigades of the division, and is now on Maryland soil. We will have the satisfaction of treading it tomorrow. I do not know anything officially or certainly of General Lee's intentions, but from the movements I have seen and heard of, we have very little doubt that an advance into Maryland is in contemplation. I know there would be a universal feeling of disappointment and disgust in the Army if it would turn out not to be so. I wish I could write you a long and interesting letter, my darling. It seems as it would be some time before an opportunity for doing so will occur. If we advance, of course, our communication with the rear will become more and more precarious. And if we keep going at the rate we've been going lately, we will be fagged out and broken down all the time. I'm afraid to tell you the number of my men who have struggled for my brigade on the road from Richmond to this place. I am more pleased than I can tell you, my darling, at the cheerful tone of your last letter. I hope and trust that you will continue so, notwithstanding the fact that you will hear from me comparatively seldom. But you will know that I am in the good hands of Providence, and you will believe that all will work out well for us. I believe it myself, confidently, cheerfully. And now I would like to tell you a brief quote that was written on August 19th, in which he wrote, "Oh, my darling, I love you too much for this life that we have to lead. God help you, my darling, my precious. Kiss our little Ewing for me, and don't let him forget me. Make him call my name. I know he can do it. I love you, my darling." That letter, that last quote, was written a month before Antietam. It's as if he knows that he will not survive, and he wants his child to remember him. Little could any of them have known that 150 years later, this family would gather, and we would say his name, and we would remember him. Thank you.
Wasn't that beautiful? Aren't we lucky to have ancestors that were such voracious writers, and that we had all those letters saved over the decades? We're just so fortunate as a family. That brings us to our next family member who arrived at Bella Ventinum, a little teenager. And we're going to have another family volunteer that is a protector of many family heirlooms, including old Burgwyn land. William Hyslop Sumner Burgwyn had no children, so we have the next best thing. We have a nephew from Jackson, North Carolina, Steve Burgwyn.
Wow, that's going to be kind of tough to follow. I've been given the WHS Burgwyn qualified. I'll be brief. He was born in July 1845, second son of Henry and Anna Greenhouse, and the great grandson of John Burgwyn. A well-educated man. I have a list of his education. He was a lawyer, graduated from Harvard, and he was a doctor, graduated from Maryland Medical School. Both of those things served him well, and he was quite a student. He was a business leader, formed many businesses. He left his law degree, law practice in Maryland, and moved to Henderson, North Carolina, and opened several banks. Founded a water works and electric company, and he was a speaker, a writer, very accomplished man. And I'm kind of saving his Civil War exploits for a man. As we were just told, he enlisted at the age of 15. He was appointed as a lieutenant and drill master, rose to the rank of captain, and participated in campaigns from Antietam, Fredericksburg, Eastern Holland, Eastern North Carolina, Drury's Bluff, Cold Harbor, Fort Harrison. That is so brief, it's almost ridiculous as to what high quality this WHS Burgwyn was. But I just hold up this book, and I know I was talking to Cousin Marty. This is an excellent book concerning his Civil War exploits and his successes. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the man, what we know about him. Gentleman wrote in a wonderful email. Excuse me. One thing we always heard about Uncle Will was that he was somewhat of a stern man, and that came from his our grandfather WHS Burgwyn, who was named for him, and never went by the junior. Our granddad was also WHS. But our grandfather was actually raised by Uncle Will. And we always heard from him that Uncle Will was a stern man and not much fun to be around. Well, it's quite possibly true, because as Tillman wrote this, and I've heard this on the plane too, here it is in a nutshell. He went to boarding school at age 9. He joined the Confederate Army before he was 16. He was in the thick of fights at Antietam and Fredericksburg, both of which he describes in detail. So if you don't have this book, get it. It's a great, great book to read. He lost his dear brother half before he was 18. He was wounded at Cold Harbor at age 19. He was wounded again and captured at Fort Harrison. He spent 5 months in a POW camp, all before he was 20 years old. So it makes perfect sense that he might have been intolerant of a little kid. So when we hear he was stern, he probably was a very no-nonsense type of man. And I've always been extremely proud to be his nephew. I want to say just a real quick thing from my heart. Tillman's brothers and sisters, our cousin Margaret, Anna, and Molly, King's brothers, myself and my brothers grew up in Northampton County, where this man grew up. And I want to tell you that growing up with the Burgwyn name attached to us, a definite responsibility went with that. But it did nothing, and it's done nothing to serve us and me particularly well. It's been having Burgwyn attached to my name is an honor. I want to finish my brief talk here by telling you a quick story. I live on and actually own some of the original land that we talked about today. And I run a hunt club. It's called Burgwyn. And each year, invariably, I will have at least 1 or 2 or 3 people come in and say, well, now, who are you? And tell me a little bit about your family. And so these are hunters. And so we sit and we talk, and there was one particular man I was talking to about our family. And I told him that the board colonel and board colonel's dad owned the land, and everybody walks the land, and John Fanning and John Burgwyn and Anna Marino, and he stopped me. He stopped me and said, son, have you got any idea how blessed you are? I said, well, I guess. I don't know what you mean. He said, well, you sit here and you tell me all like these people, generation after generation, generation. I don't even know who my daddy is. I don't know who my mom is. I don't know who my brothers, sisters, cousins. I don't know anything. It's me. And well, the conversation had to end. But I went home and I thought about that, and I have been thinking about it ever since. And I want you to think about it too. We are blessed. I am so proud to be here. I'm so proud of my cousins. I'm so proud that I've got this family. And that's my talk.
I think Steve agrees with me. We're lucky. All right. Our next battle was Gettysburg. We went to Gettysburg. And the first family member to arrive on that field was Boy Colonel Henry King Jr. And arriving all the way from Denver to tell us about Henry is a North Carolinian born and bred. You're not going to scratch the tar off his heel. even though he went to Denver. But who better to tell us about War Colonel than Henry King Burgwyn V.
Around 1925, my grandfather was running for the Democratic nomination to be Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina. He was traveling out in the western part of our state, along with Steve's father. And they were going in country stores of one kind or another. Granddaddy goes in, introduces himself to everybody. This old guy sitting in the back of the store, long white beard. Granddaddy goes over and says, "My name is something Burgwyn. I'm running for Lieutenant Governor. I appreciate your support." This guy says, "Burgwyn, I remember Colonel Burgwyn. I went with him to Pennsylvania. Things didn't work out very well. He was a mighty strict man. He always knew what to do. He always knew what to do." And that's a legacy that's persisted in our family for 150 years. What I'm going to try to do is not replicate what you heard on the bus and so on and so forth. I'm going to try to fill in some gaps about his short life and emphasize some of the things that hopefully you haven't heard before. He was born in Jamaica Plain, up in Boston, at the Loring Greeno House. Kathy and I were in Boston some time ago, and we went to the Loring Greeno House, expecting a tremendous welcome. The ladies who run the museum there said, "Well, we're so happy to see you. You must be Tillman Cooley's cousin." It was all downhill from there. I'm sitting there saying, "Hey, wait a minute, I'm kind of the star of the show. How the hell do you know who Tillman Cooley is?" Well, anyway, after Harry was born in 1841, his family traveled back to North Carolina, to our beloved part of the country where Steve and JoJo live, called the Occoneechee Neck. The Occoneechee Neck is roughly a 20,000 acre body of land that's surrounded on three sides by the Roanoke River. As Tillman pointed out, we inherited in 1840 about 14,000 acres, along with several hundred slaves. John Burgwyn and John Devereaux, upon the death of Mr. Pollock, had entered into a handshake agreement. Burgwyn's getting the land in Northampton County, the Devereaux's get the land in Halifax County. We're going to commission a survey, and we'll balance it out after the survey and the assessments are done. All that unfolded in the 1840s. Tillman says the Burgwyns won. I'm not so sure the Burgwyns won. The one thing that Mr. Pollock was extremely good at was borrowing money. He wasn't so good at paying it back. So both the Burgwyns and the Devereaux were saddled with enormous debts as a result of their inheritance. When Henry Burgwyn and his father, John Fanning, and his brothers arrived at the Neck in 1841, they found a completely wild environment, old growth forest, and only about a third of the land that they inherited was ready to be cultivated. The rest of it was overgrown, a little more than a swamp. Henry had been to West Point, as Tillman pointed out, and he had civil engineering skills. So he directed the slaves to clear the land for crops, and to drain the land, which miraculously rid that area of mosquitoes. One of the things that was not said on the bus tour this morning that I find interesting is about 750,000 people got killed in the Civil War. About a third of those people died from malaria. Mostly Union soldiers who had crossed into the South and were bitten by mosquitoes and died. So with all the talk about the machinery and the guns and so on and so forth, the most lethal killer in the Civil War was the mosquito. Harry stayed at the Occoneechee Neck until he was about 10 years old. Henry Burgwyn had created a self-sufficient agricultural community. An enormous effort by the slaves to create a flour mill, a grist mill, a cotton gin, so on and so forth. They raised all the food that they needed for 200 to 300 slaves at the Occoneechee. And when you go to the Occoneechee, and I certainly encourage you to do so, you will see gigantic fields that Henry created, some of which are 300 acres in one single field. He also made another strategic decision. He stopped growing cotton. Mr. Pollock and his associates had grown cotton in that area since the early part of the 18th century. The land that the Burgwyns inherited was virtually worthless. It had been depleted from years and years and years of growing cotton. Henry knew nothing about farming, absolutely nothing. But he was an intelligent person, he studied very hard, and he figured out very quickly that it was necessary to convert to wheat, which he did to a very large degree. He also brought in expensive machinery, which his father paid for. And they began to create what was later on deemed to be one of the most modern and scientific farms anywhere in the South. He built a hospital for the slaves. He built homes for all the slaves, providing food and clothing. He also built a church for the slaves. And this was manifested in 1845 when the head of the Greeno family, the illustrious General William Hyslop Sumner, arrived unannounced at the Neck. General Sumner was, in Tillman's estimation, kind of a fictitious military figure. But he was a great businessman. A great businessman. And he was one of the first real estate developers in the Boston area. He created a garden community in the area which is today around Logan Airport. And he made an enormous fortune. So he shows up at the Neck, again, to see his grandchildren. And what does he do? He brings all of the slaves a present. So imagine here you are in the middle of nowhere, a slave community, and this very bombastic individual arrives on the scene with trunk loads of presents for all the black people. And that included bonnets for the ladies, scarves, all the men got a pullover jersey, and a nice hat. I can just imagine the enormous impact this must have had on someone like Harry, who was a little boy at that time, 5 or 6 years old. General Sumner continued to be a major influence on Harry. He was an individual who knew how to give orders, but most importantly, he knew how to get results. When he was 10 years old, Harry went off to school. Went to Baltimore to private school. During the summers, rather than go back to the Neck, he went to Jamaica Plain to spend the summers with his grandparents because that was the mosquito season. So he and his younger brother rarely ever went to the neck after they were about 10 or 11 years old. The smartest thing in the world that Henry Burgwyn ever did was to name his second son after General Sumner. Because when things got really, really bad for us, General Sumner gave his granddaughter, Anna Greeno, what we would call today an annuity, based on the money he had made in the real estate business. If he had not have done that, after the war, we would have really been in trouble. So anyway, Henry, or Harry as he was then called, eventually when he was 15 years old, as someone else has already said, was sent to West Point. His father had attended the military academy in the 1820s. He had made friends with a number of fairly famous people, most notably Jefferson Davis, who had served with his cousin, John Henry King Burgwyn, out in the western United States. So there was a great affection with Jefferson Davis and the Burgwyn family. Jefferson Davis tried to get Harry into West Point. At that time, he was the Secretary of War. Okay? He writes his recommendation to get Harry into West Point. And President Buchanan turned it down. I'm not sure how much more that could have been done. So Harry, at that time, he's 15 years old. He's up in West Point, New York, all by himself. Okay? And he has the wherewithal to get on a steamship, back to North Carolina, right by himself, and then he makes another major choice. He goes to that illustrious institution, University of North Carolina, and graduates in what, 2 years? Couldn't have been such a tough place to go to school.
It's a lot tougher now.
Yeah, well, NC State had not been created yet. I mean, this is a man who was born to go to NC State. If there ever was true. Well, anyway, when the war started, Harry had then gone on to VMI. I think many people in the South had envisioned the war on the horizon. Things were not going well for us down south. Henry Burgwyn was a very, very strong proponent of secession. He believed strongly that the South could create their own country, that he and his sons would be the leaders in that country. I think that's a very important motivation behind what went on in the next few years. They really, really felt as though if they could break away from the United States and have their own country, they would be much, much better off. War breaks out. Harry, as someone mentioned before, has some military training. He is sent to Raleigh to be an instructor in the camp of the new recruits, most of whom were from western North Carolina. He had gone out himself to the western counties and recruited individuals to become members of the Confederate Army. Harry was then, shortly thereafter, elected to be the head of his enormous regiment, some 800 men. Elected. He's 19 years old. So at that point in time, he's responsible for the care and well-being of about 1,000 people, most of whom are a little older than he is. So this is a big responsibility. So they are sent down to the coast of North Carolina, and they are engaged in several battles at that point in time. He then went up to Petersburg in that area where he, Harry, witnessed the enormous carnage that occurred in the battles around Richmond in 1862. And he must have understood that being a capital officer in the Confederate Army, his lifespan was not going to be very long. There was no way in the world that he was going to be able to survive the kind of fighting that was going on. At that time, in early 1863, the Confederate government ran out of money. They also had run out of artillery and small arms. So they decided they were going to have this gigantic bond issue, underwritten by the Rothschilds, to raise money in order to buy the new Enfield rifle, which was being made in England, and then some of the cannons that you saw on our tour today. Henry Burgwyn and a number of other people put up what amounts to the collateral for that bond issue, which was cotton. So all the cotton that had been raised at the neck in the last 4 or 5 years was taken to Norfolk and put in large warehouses as the collateral for this bond issue. So if the Confederate government did not make their payments on time, someone who bought one of these bonds, and somebody had a picture of it over here, they could go to Norfolk and seize the cotton. Well, anyway, the rates on the bonds were pretty low. It was only 3%. But you didn't have to pay taxes, so I guess it was a pretty good deal. But they raised a huge amount of money on this bond issue. Again, collateral is in Norfolk in these warehouses. Henry's arch enemy, Thomas Pollock Devereux, which is also portrayed in here, also sent a huge amount of cotton down to Norfolk to serve as the collateral for the bond issue. Henry and Thomas hated each other. The reason we know about all this is that Henry had written what were called his farm journals during the 1840s. This was his portrayal of his daily activities and all of the legal battles which we lost against the Devereux. That when the surveys were actually done, it turned out that the Burgwyns had too much land, and so the bargain was you got to pay the Devereux all this money in order to balance the accounts. Furthermore, you had this looming debt from Mr. Pollock, which was not paid. So times were not quite as good as everybody thought. Henry was able to, with his father's money, basically pay off the Devereux. He also sold a lot of slaves in order to do that. But things had gotten better at the neck. He cleared a lot of the land, the wheat prices were going up. In 1855, Henry made $100,000. It was written up in the American agricultural journals as one of the most successful farmers in the United States. $100,000 today is $2 or $3 million. So Henry invested all of that money in buying these Confederate bonds. Millions and millions of dollars in today's money went to buy the bonds which paid for the rifles, which were used in the battle that you just toured a few minutes ago. Harry's regiment in the spring of 1863 was assigned to start moving up into Pennsylvania. He had done well enough in the earlier battles, mainly in a reserve capacity, but he was a good organizer. He was able to feed and clothe his men, 1,000 of which were under his responsibility, that his corps commander and the governor of North Carolina nominated him to be a brigadier general. So that process was underway in the spring of 1863 when I started to this location. It was very, very hot, as someone pointed out, when they came up into Pennsylvania. And when they arrived here, many men had dropped out. He was down from roughly 1,000 to about 800 guys who were in his military group. So the morning that the battle took place, that you witnessed a few minutes ago, he had, as I said, about 800 men ready to go with these Enfield rifles. And the infield rifle was the miracle weapon of its day. It could fire very quickly and very accurately. And the tour guide was telling you that it had an accuracy of 400 or 500 yards. Well, Henry wrote to his father and said, you know, in the experience he had with his 18-year-old guys in western North Carolina, they couldn't hit a barn if it was 50 yards away. So the panic of the battle, the smoke, and so on and so forth made it very, very difficult in order to actually perform your duty in this kind of circumstances. Harry's technique then was to get as close as he could to the Union lines, because he knew his guys was not going to be able to hit anybody from 400 or 500 yards away. So as the tour guide explained, the tactic was to get within about 100 yards of the Union troops. He also said something very strange out there, was the notion of shooting over somebody's shoulder.
Yeah.
I can assure you that did not happen. The way Harry had explained it was there were two lines. When the first line shot, they kneeled down. Okay? So the second line could, in effect, shoot over their heads. But none of this putting a rifle by your ear. I mean, that was nuts. But unfortunately, even though he carried a full canteen of peach brandy, which has been carried on in the Burgwyn family for a very long time, we all have our canteen wherever we go full of peach brandy. And he had about half of it, but they got to the point where they gave the order that you've got to go against the Black Hats who are entrenched on that ridge where we stood today. The individuals that he was up against were mainly from the Western Territories. They were not the shopkeepers from New England and New York. These were really, really rough guys. And you know, they were there to kill people. You know, it was fascinating to me that, first of all, the guys that Harry had recruited from Western North Carolina had probably never seen a black person in their lives. And the book that John wrote about Henry's, he calls him a valet, Henry's slave, was probably the first black person that anyone in the 26 had ever seen before. And then they're up against guys from Michigan and Wisconsin who'd also probably never seen a black person in their lives. So the notion of this fight being conducted primarily over slavery, I think, you know, is tempered by the notion that it was somewhat of an academic concept in many people's minds. The Southern guys, as was said earlier today, were told if we can win this battle at Gettysburg, it's going to be over. They're going to give up. If we can kill enough people in the next few days, I'm absolutely sure the North is going to give up. We're going to have our own country. We're all going to have a better life. So this is why, in my humble opinion, they decided on the third day to make this absolutely senseless attack on the Union lines where 14,000 people pulled out a piece of paper, wrote their name and address on the piece of paper, and pinned it to their uniform, because they knew they were going to do it. And they wanted to make sure that their body was sent back to their home. But it was absolutely a death sentence to make that charge. They had no chance, in my humble opinion, of destroying the Union lines, because at that time, again, guys from western part of the United States, they were not going to run. I mean, they were there to kill people. And I think we can't underestimate that too much. Well, anyway, as was pointed out, Harry got killed. And his body was buried by this big walnut tree. And then his slave took his horses and other utility instruments and so on and so, and he walked back to the neck. Is that right? How in the world that happened is beyond me, but he took the horses and walked, how many miles would it have been? 500 miles?
300.
300 miles. He walks all the way back to the neck.
Could you tell us what the neck is? And
The neck is Doconichi Neck. It was the Burgwyn plantation in Northampton County near Jackson where Steve lives today. It was a huge farming operation. Henry Burgwyn I ran it. Self-sufficient agricultural community. One of the most fascinating things that Henry did when he switched to wheat, he imported tons and tons of guano from Peru.
explain what one.
Guano is bat shit. Okay? It will store the nitrogen in the land. Henry paid $40 a ton to bring the guano all the way around Cape Horn into Norfolk, and it was brought up the Roanoke River and downloaded at the Burgwyn plantation. He bought tons and thousands of tons of guano, which the slaves then plowed into the fields. And the enormous success that Steve Burgwyn has had in the farming world is largely a result of that bat shit that was brought in the 1800s.
Here's the movie mentioned.
How did he inherit the 14,000 acres and why?
Well, as Tim pointed out, Mr. Pollock felt as though he was kin to the Devereaux and the Burgwyns. And he didn't have a will, and so knowing all that, John Burgwyn and John Devereaux had a meeting in New Bern, North Carolina, and they made a deal. You, the Devereaux, get this land, the Burgwyns get this land. Now, only John Burgwyn had ever been to the neck because Mr. Pollock trusted him, and every year when he would finally return from his travels in Europe, he would come to New Bern, and he and John Burgwyn would go up to the neck and inspect the properties. Okay? Mr. Pollock knew nothing about farming. You know, his family had been in the farming business since they confiscated the land around 1715, 1725 from the Tuscaroyans. Yeah, but he was the epitome of a social gentleman. Okay? None of this got committed to writing. When he finally got around to doing the surveys, as I said earlier, Burgwyns evidently had too much land. Devereaux sued him, he loses in court, and so on and so forth. So will that, yes ma'am?
Didn't Occoneechee come from the Indian tribe?
Yes. It did. Right, and it had been a farming area for millennia, long time. But when Henry got there, those giant fields that Bill Johnston has now did not exist. Not to the degree that they do today. So all of that was cleared and plowed, and again, the batshit was plowed into the land in order to create these enormous wheat crops, which were sold primarily in New York City. And Henry made a great fortune selling wheat and corn. He made a great deal of money, as I said earlier, which he, along with his father, held in trust at the Mechanics Bank in New York City.
Part of the flooding added to the river.
That's right. The other thing that JoJo is bringing up is that Roanoke River floods every year. So it's both a good and a bad thing. One, it can wash out the crops, but most importantly, though, it's bringing new soil from the bottom of the river into the fields which surround the area. There's a great flood, of course, in 1940, in which it's reputed that the silver from the Burgwyn household, which was buried when Steve's great friend General Sherman came north, and that in that flood the silver was going to be exposed. And Steve's mother wrote a very wonderful book called River Treasure about that entire sequence of events. Yes, ma'am.
Henry is Harry's father?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Got it.
Right. Okay, can I answer any question? Yes, sir.
Well, you may know this and some other folks may know this, but we've had a lot of fun with the idea of guano and batshit. But at one point, the price of guano, I believe, rivaled the price of gold, and there was a war in South America.
You're exactly right.
South American countries over who would get the guano. So it was probably a really good idea, and maybe Henry King Burgwyn was a little ahead of the curve in terms of importing guano. But at some point, the rest of the world discovered guano, and for a while, he controlled the guano, didn't control his region of the world.
All right, it's a very, very good point. And Kathy and I were recently in Peru, and we went out to the Guano Islands just to make sure the birds were still there. And lo and behold, the docks where the boats came in are still there. You know, the guano was cut by what amounts to Chinese slaves, loaded in burlap bags and put on these clipper ships, which then came around Cape Horn and into North Virginia and into Baltimore. And it was just a good point that, you know, it was the goal of its day. Now, unfortunately, guano kills potatoes. So the guano that went into Ireland, for example, had exactly the wrong result. It created a parasite which ended up killing the potato crop in Ireland, and of course all the Irish people came over to the United States. Someone talked about earlier the notion of freeing the slaves and replacing them with Irish workers. We tried that.
Yeah.
The Greenos and the Dones and the Stoddards from Boston were abolitionists. They were members of the Unitarian Church. They absolutely hated slavery. And there was enormous pressure on Henry Burgwyn to free the slaves. As benevolent as he was, his northern relatives were putting tremendous pressure on him. So he agreed to this harebrained scheme where Mr. Dane, for example, was going to recruit hundreds of Irish people from Boston. And they were going to come down to the neck and in effect replace the slaves. Well, unfortunately, malaria was looming out in the swamps, and they didn't last long, but before the malaria got them, the whiskey did. And they would go over to Halifax and get drunk every night, and Henry was not going to tolerate that. So after a couple of months of this, before malaria had killed most of these Irish people, Henry put a stop to it and fired everybody, which infuriated his in-laws. So he was able to say, hey, I tried it. I tried it. Anything else? I know I've taken way too much time. What can I tell you?
I think because of his name, Henry has talked about Fort Colonel a few times before. What do you think?
Yeah.
I think you know it a little bit. The next member of our family that arrived at the battlefield at Gettysburg was General Junius Daniel, Brigadier General Junius Daniel. He was an outlaw to the family, not a true descendant of John Burgwyn, but he married into the Long family. And the children of Nat Burgwyn and Carl Burgwyn will always be indebted to the Longs. In 1925, early 1925, our grandmother went to go see Dr. Long, Nick's grandfather, and said, "I got a tumor." He said, "No, you got twins." So he went on to successfully deliver twins from this 45-year-old woman. So very thankful for that, and very thankful to the Long family. And Nick is going to tell us about Junius Daniels.
Thank you, sir. I'm very cognizant of standing between Pat Schitt and Mike Deaver. And I'm also realizing that we're getting close to 3:30 and the second games are kicking off, so I'm going to try and move through this fairly quickly. Particularly as it was pointed out, I was appointed to Junius Daniel, who, for a very small section of us, is very, very close kin. The folks in the very back table, I think we're all very close kin. But for the rest of you Burgwyns, he is very collateral kin. Brigadier Junius Daniel was born in Halifax in 1828. You've heard a lot about Northampton County and the Neck. The other side, obviously, if the river goes one way, it's got a bow in and there's a bow out. So the bow that creates Occoneechee Neck on the Northampton County side, on the other side is Scotland Neck on the Halifax County side where the Devereux were. Halifax proper was directly across from the Roanoke River from Occoneechee Neck, where Steve still lives. And so that was the home of a lot of colonial ancestors, in particular the Daniel, of whom we're going to talk about for just the next few minutes. Junius Daniel was the son of the Attorney General for the state of North Carolina, John Reeves Jones Daniel. And the Jones is important. He was a direct descendant of Robin Jones. Many of us who are descendant from Mariah Greeno Burgwyn, the niece of the boy colonel, she married Dr. T.W. M. Long, Dr. Thomas Williams Mason Long. All of us are directly descendants of, among other things, my namesake, Nicholas Long, and Wiley Jones. The reason all this is important is Junius Daniel, the general that we're going to talk about, is kin to those of us who are descended from Minnie Burgwyn and Tom Long 4 different ways. He was my second cousin 3 times removed by Colonel Nicholas Long. Through his father, John Reed Jones Daniel, the Attorney General, he is my second cousin 4 times removed through Robin Jones. His wife, or his mother, Martha Elizabeth Long Stiff, was granddaughter of Colonel Nicholas Long. So she is my first cousin 3 times removed. He married Ellen Williams Long, who is my first cousin 3 times removed. So you can see that they talked about the social interaction in going to Sarasota. Obviously some of that social action took place right there in Halifax and Northampton counties. General Daniel lived in Halifax in the county seat there for his first 10 years. His father became Attorney General for the state of North Carolina in 1834. The family moved to Raleigh from 1834 to 1841. His father served as the Attorney General. John Reeves Jones Daniel was then elected to Congress and served in the U.S. Congress from 1841 to 1853. Junius Daniel was able to get into West Point. His father being a congressman may have had something to do with that. He was a member who started at West Point in 1846. He would have graduated with a class of 1850, but 6 weeks before his graduation, he was injured in an artillery accident, missed his graduation final exams, and so was allowed to come back, and he actually is a graduate of the class of 1851. In 1851, he was appointed a brevet second lieutenant. He then went to the West, served most of his time in New Mexico, and probably was from Albuquerque all the way down to Juarez, Mexico. He then left there, and in 1856, his father, the congressman, had decided in 1854 not to stand for re-election, had purchased a great deal of land outside of Shreveport, Louisiana, and started a plantation there. Junius Daniel went to the plantation on behalf of his father, who was still living in Halifax, North Carolina at the time, and ran the farm for 2 years. In 1860, he came back to Halifax and married his second cousin, the 22-year-old, he was then 33, his 22-year-old cousin of Ellen Williams Long. When the war came, he was living in Louisiana. He was offered posts in both the Federal Army and Louisiana. He chose to come back to North Carolina, where he served as a colonel, first in the 14th North Carolina and then in the 45th North Carolina. He did accept appointment as colonel of the 45th North Carolina in April 1862. Their job at that point in time was to serve as part of the protection for Petersburg and Richmond. After about 4 months, in the remainder of 1862, after the Battle of Drury's Bluff, he returned back to North Carolina, and in September of 1862, he was appointed Brigadier General. Most of his action in the spring of fall of 1862, spring of 1863, consisted of defense work around Goldsboro and Newburgh. At the point that we focused on today, he had been moved to, in May of 1863, just after the Battle of Chancellorsville, they had been reassigned to the defense of Richmond. Before they even got to Richmond, they were assigned to come on with the rest of the Army to come on this jump to Pennsylvania. He was serving with Rhodes Division. As you heard earlier, one of the things they were doing was going to take the Pennsylvania capital of Harrisburg. Rhodes was already 30 miles further north in that direction. On June the 29th, they were told to come back. By July the 1st, the day of the first battle, Junius Daniel's regiments were basically 8 miles north of here on the Chambersburg Road. You saw when we first stopped the bus today, there was the beginning point of the battle as far as Junius Daniel was concerned. His battalion started there at what is now the Peace Monument and proceeded through those fields down to where we went to the restrooms. That barn there was one of the points that they still mark as the turn. He attacked a group of Pennsylvania, 3 regiments of Pennsylvania troops, and they turned and moved up the railroad crossing that we made just before we crossed the bridge on the bus. They were able to, first of all, were stopped for about an hour and a half because they didn't recognize that the railroad cut was there, and there were a regiment of Pennsylvania troops that were in that. They finally were able to get outside and then push back down and push them out. At the end of the first day, General Daniel's troops were 2 brigades over. You saw the 26th. Brockenbrough was between them, and then Junius Daniel was moving on. They moved up into, they spent the night at the Lutheran Seminary. They were then ordered to go to Culp's Hill, which was the other end of the Fishhook, the mountain there, or the entrenched Union forces there. All of the second day, they were under fairly heavy fire trying to take Culp's Hill. They were eventually unable to do that. Because of their service in the first and second days, they were not part of Pickett's charge, and so they were one of the few units that was still in pretty good shape as the retreat began. And because of that, Rhodes Division, of which Junius Daniel was a part, were the main rear guard. And so from July 5th until July the 15th, they're engaged in fairly regular skirmishes as they try and protect the supply train as they retreat back to Hagerstown and then back across the Potomac and into Virginia. That was clearly not the end of Junius Daniel's service. He continued through the rest of 1863 serving with the Army of Northern Virginia, involved in most of their actions. He was killed on May the 12th, 1864 at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse during a counterattack on Union troops at what was known there as the Bloody Angle. He was hit in the stomach by a ball and died the next day later. Once he realized that he was not going to be able to return to his wife and to Halifax, he sent his love and said to give everything he could to her because she deserved more. He was buried at the historic colonial churchyard graveyard there in Halifax. His widow lived on for she died in 1932. I can still remember my father when he was 8 or 9 years old talking about going to visit cousin Ellen in Henderson, where she lived. When she died in 1932, she was also buried alongside her husband in the colonial graveyard in Halifax. I'm going to turn it over to you.
He's got my big intro.
You got your intro, sorry.
Well, the 5th family member to arrive on the battlefield, the 3rd to arrive at Gettysburg, was another outlaw, Thomas Good Jones. And he was a BMI, another teenager, by the way, a BMI graduate, and a descendant of, he would marry a descendant of Caroline Burgwin. And speak about Thomas Good Jones is another BMI graduate and a descendant of Caroline. Mike Denton.
Hi, everybody. I got up last night, so that was my introduction, I suppose. Because the original immigrants had 2 sons and a daughter, and I'm the only descendant of the daughter, it strikes me, you might wonder how my line of the family thinks about you all. And you see a number of my line here, so it basically goes from Burgwyn to Clitherals to the Joneses to the Maries, and my mother was a Mari. And Mari is no chop-liver name in the South. You know, it's fairly well known in various different circles. And for the Mari family to be putting y'all in just as high a cotton as their own line is really, that says a whole lot. Because again, they're really, from Burgwyn to Clitheroe, it's the Clitherals that carried the story down to Alabama, that moved the story to Alabama and carried it on there. And so it's interesting to me that the best thing I can show you about how they feel is this book right here. This is my great aunt's copy of the published book that I think is, for a good long while was the best thing we had available. So the title of it is The Burgwyn Family History. And when you open it up, it says John Jones, Virginian, John Burgwyn, Carolinian. And look at this, look at the copy. It's, she used it so much that there's no binding on it anymore. She was in and out of it. I'd rather you didn't, but if you were to thumb through it very carefully, if you do, you'll see all sorts of notes that she has in here. Not just of per particular, directs, but a lot of respect and a lot of love that is part of this book. So eventually I got this book out. And so getting this assignment was, for volunteering for this. It's been a neat experience for me, as most family history projects are, because it explained a couple of things to me. The title of this book, Jones and Burgwyn, always confused me, because once I went through it, and I got through the Burgwyn part, I was very interested, and I said, oh, well, I guess, this Jones family, I guess I got to read through that. Well, it turns out I'm a direct descendant of Jones as well. And so I get this assignment to talk about Thomas Good Jones, and the best thing I could find was this book. Well, his son wrote it. So, of course, the best thing on Thomas Good Jones is in the Burgwyn, one of the good Burgwyn histories. And it was neat to figure out, okay, now that's the connection. Finally, I get it. The Joneses and the Burgwyns are connected in that way. By the way, there's a whole other set of Joneses that are down my line that are mentioned here. Harvey Ellis Jones, you'll see his picture come by, actually unrelated. So Thomas Good Jones is connected because he married one of the Clitheroe girls. And so he's not a cousin here, but there's a lot of parallels. It's amazing that he and Henry King Burgwyn were not brothers. They actually look alike. That's the author of the diaries, this big 4 or 5 inches of paper over here, that a lot of this story comes from. But the two, Thomas Good Jones and Henry King Burgwyn, they look similar. They were both well educated. They both went to VMI. They were both noted in particular for being, there was a legacy mentioned earlier, or a trait of the family, and I think this is common to it. They were very highly disciplined and kind of fastidious officers. They did things very precisely. Now, Henry King was he was the line combat officer, he was a regimental commander. Thomas Good Jones went to VMI, he drilled in Richmond, helped drill some soldiers in Richmond, went back to VMI. He was with Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah campaign. He was part of General Lee's Army in Northern Virginia. And then he went up to Gettysburg under General Gordon. And that's important because Gordon ended up being a governor, I believe, as well. And so a connection with Gordon and politics and the concepts that are taught at VMI. VMI is all about what they call the citizen soldier. So VMI is not West Point or the Naval Academy that produces professional military officers. They produce citizen soldiers. And Thomas Good Jones definitely was one of those. And I hope that's not my phone. Oh, it probably is. Here you go. There you go. I love that tune. That's my wife, who is not here. I should answer it and make everybody hear that. Make her listen to my lecture. So anyway, he was a consummate citizen soldier, but he was a staff officer, not a line commander. So, in other words, he's working for General Gordon. So how did he distinguish himself in the Battle of Gettysburg? Well, prior to that, he'd been wounded in 4 different battles before Gettysburg. So he'd already been noted as an officer that you could put him in charge of something, and it was going to go pretty well, and he was going to see it all the way through. In particular, in Gettysburg, the only thing I read, and please speak up if you all know differently than this, that Thomas Good Jones did at Gettysburg was he had to send, there was a particularly dangerous line that had to be traversed with a message between the generals, the staff officers, typically helping the general organize and direct the forces, of course, and communicate with other generals. And he was the youngest general, and he was the youngest officer on the staff at the time that this particular missive had to cross the field, and he was the only one without any, either unmarried, he was unmarried and had no children. I'm not sure, there might have been someone else who was married but didn't have any kids. Bottom line is, it was to his lot and he stepped up very quickly to do it, and he went through withering fire, going across and back. But we have that first-hand account from generals who saw what he went through and didn't think there was any way he was going to make it through. He volunteered, he did it. It's a little different type of valor than we've heard a lot about today. but it's very impressive nonetheless. He comes back, he gets out of Gettysburg, the whole thing, and it's good that my talk is the last and won't be too much longer, because it's kind of a neat segue for a couple different reasons. So he comes out of that battle, out of Gettysburg, and he finds his way, and he ends up being at Appomattox. And he is he's listed in the stories here as a major in Appomattox. And there's some question as to exactly when he received certain promotions, because the records weren't great because we lost. But we'll say he was a major. And there's an account in the Jones Burgwyn biography or family biography that is beautifully written, and it's quoting a general from a Union general who watched him ride across the field in perfect military bearing with a flag of surrender. There were several flags of surrender that were delivered, and he had one of them though. And the general's description, and I won't read through it here, although I'm very tempted to, is very impressive as to how he carried himself. And he comes across the field, and I will read. I'm going to read a little bit of this. He says, this is Brevet Major General Joshua Chamberlain at Appomattox, and this is a book that he wrote afterwards about his experience there. Suddenly rose to sight another form, close to in our own front, a soldierly figure, handsomely dressed and mounted, a Confederate staff officer undoubtedly, to whom some of my advance lines seemed to be pointing in my position. Now I see the flag, earnestly borne, and its possible, purport sweeps my inner vision like a wraith of morning mist. In other words, he rides up to him fairly dramatically, and he says, the messenger draws near, dismounts with a graceful salute, and hardly suppressed emotion delivers his message, quote, "Sir, I am from General Gordon. General Lee desires a cessation of hostilities until he can hear from General Grant as to proposed surrender." The general writes back, in speaking what was on his mind. He says, "What word is this? So long, so dearly fought for, so feverishly dreamed, but ever snatched away, held hidden and aloof, now smiting the senses with dizzy flash, surrender." And he says, "Sir, that matter exceeds my authority. I will send to my superior. General Lee is right. He can do no more." And he leaves. So he had the honor, the dubious honor, if you will, of making that delivery, and he did it in such a way that he impressed many years later. This book was written 40 years later, I think, and that's how impressed he was with the way our, in-law presented himself. He went on to go back to Alabama, and he was part of the militia that they had there and the home guard, and he was involved in a few actions where they had some troubles. And he eventually tried some farming. He was a son of a railroad man of modest success. So he gets back, tries some farming, doesn't work, he goes into cotton. Cotton goes bad that year. And he ends up working for state government, for the judicial system and the legislative system. Then he gets elected to the legislature. The next year he's a speaker of the legislature. And then several years after that he becomes governor of Alabama for 4 years. Again, the citizen soldier concept. And going from the battlefields, wounded in so many form, and going through Gettysburg, doing the flag Appomattox, now he's serving the country in a whole nother capacity. And he's most noted for and he did a wonderful, I'm not going to belabor the thing about being governor. It was an extremely difficult time to be governor. If you go into this book, it's the last chapter, it's about his own father, so you can imagine there's plenty of emotion in the wording. But what a tough time to be there. He made some bad choices, politically, but they were principled choices. In retrospect, we might say they were bad, like white supremacy, for instance. At one point, he yielded to that political favor that he could gain from that, but otherwise took very principled and stands that have stood the test of time. But he was quite famous, or he became famous. The reason why he became a political liability, other than being a friend of Gordon's, and I'll close with this, is he came out and made a speech. And he gained national reputation. This was at Oakwood Cemetery in Montgomery. And the speech did a lot. At the time, there was a great deal of vindictiveness, of course. The North was there. The Wilmers that are here, there's a Bishop Wilmer you'll see flash by. He's my third great-grandfather. And he was the Bishop of Alabama and wouldn't do a prayer to the president. After the Civil War, during the occupation, they shut down all Episcopal churches in Alabama because of him. He had two brothers who were also bishops in the South, and so they were very closely connected to Joneses and the Wilmers and the Clithables. So anyway, Thomas Goode Jones, just before he became a political figure, he came to Oakwood, and he says he's trying to mend the vindictiveness, and he's trying to go forward, as we should, from this battle field, and in a unified way. He says, quote, "And while we ponder thus, the mind carries us northward, where the tombs, not of our dead, are whiter than the sands of the sea." So many, in other words, white Union grave markers. Whiter than the sands of the sea, and more numerous than the stars in the heavens. In them lie men of the same race as ourselves, who spoke the same language and worshiped the same God. Fond mothers sent them to battle, and tender tears and agonizing prayers watched their pathway. They followed a flag that was as dear to them as was to us, as ours was to us. And that has long since taken its flight to greet its warrior soul. And he that worthily speaks for the dead or the living must say that no feeling of hate to the northern dead or those who mourn them pervades this Memorial Day. A touch of pity makes the world kin. From scenes like this, where the warring sections mourn their dead, let the statesmen draw inspiration to guide the living. That was in every newspaper in America soon after that. And it's funny, right now we have trouble articulating a lot of things in the political realm, obviously with all the angst that we see in Washington, et cetera. And it's amazing what some eloquence at the right time can do. And Thomas Goode Jones was one that stood up and did it right. He lived to be about 70. He lived to 70 years of age, and was a federal judge after being a governor. And after a long fight as the federal judge and over railroad issues, after it was finally actually lost, his side lost. In the end, he passed away a couple of years later. So that's Thomas Goode Jones, and thanks for your time.
I want to make one comment. While I was thinking, while Michael was talking about the encounter between Thomas Goode Jones and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who, by the way, was the guy who was the star of the movie Gettysburg, when you watch that movie. If Thomas Goode Jones had had a crystal ball, he could have come up and said, "General Chamberlain, you're the future governor of Maine. I'm Thomas Jones, future governor of Alabama. I represent General Gordon, future governor of Georgia." All three of them. Some people yesterday asked, what was the deal about changing the spelling of the name Burgwyn from a W-I-N to a W-Y-N? We don't exactly know. The generally felt theory was that John Fanning Burgwyn, my ancestor and his namesake, changed it in his middle 20s, maybe late 20s, when there were some people in England who were forging his name to a bunch of checks. And to thwart the forgers, change the spelling. And hopefully stop that. I've got another theory, because in doing some research one time, I found there was another family of Burgwyns. That's hard to believe, but there were. In Newbern, before our family of Burgwyns got there, they used the spelling of an I, and they were an unusual bunch, to say the least. And it occurred to me that he may have also done it to differentiate himself from that previously existing group in Newbern. Most likely it was to thwart the forging of the checks.
All right, thank you. There's many theories on that, but that's two good ones. Well, that it was Welsh, and that John Burgwyn actually changed it to seem more British, so it would not be thought of as a Welshman. And that John Burgwyn didn't have a problem being a Welshman and changed it back. Time is running short. I want to thank all my volunteers. I think we all should give them a good I pestered them all throughout the summer, and I shouldn't have, because they covered it. They got it right. Our next section of our symposium, I wanted to get audience participation. So I call this section Voices from the Past. And some of you got envelopes from my lovely wife before lunch or during lunch. There should be 14 of them, so I want to see 14 envelopes. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Got them all? I'm going to walk around the room to save time. These are quotes that the committee members put together, all four of us. Pick some out to bring some of our ancestors' thoughts to y'all's lips to read to us. And I want number one, because these are in order. Number one, I'll come to you with the microphone and invite you to read your quote.
Hello all. My name is Frank Hunter McDonald. I'm descended through the North Carolina Burgwyns, and I live in Seattle, Washington. This quote is listed at the bottom as a prophetic Henry King Burgwyn Sr. quote, circa 1860. For if ever the two sections of this country engage in a trial of battle, neither France in its bloodiest days, nor England in its convulsions, nor yet Rome in its decline, could show a parallel.
Looks like Henry had a crystal ball, didn't he? Who's got number two?
Right.
Mariah.
I like it if you identify what branch you're from.
Oh,
It's nice.
I'm Mariah Burgwyn.
Put it near your
Okay, I'm Mariah Burgwyn Hunter, and I'm a descendant of the North Carolina Burgwyns. My grandmother was Mariah Greeno Burgwyn Long, always known as Minnie. The day of our departure, I am but too happy to say, has again been postponed. As each appointed day draws near, I find it harder and harder to make up my mind to part with your frequent, almost daily correspondence. All my ardor for an active life oozes out of my fingers like Bob Acres' courage, and I find myself, unlike Patrick Henry's auditors, willing to lie stupidly on my back and be bound, hand and foot, by the chains which your love has wound around me. This is a letter from George Burgwyn Anderson to his wife Mildred, circa 1860.
Thank you, Mariah. Who has number 3? Molly? My sister Molly?
So everybody knows I'm a John Fanning Burgwyn. Oh, okay. Never held a microphone before. My darling, I am just beginning to know how happy I am to realize the new and glorious world into which we have entered. Your letter received last night gave me a little glimpse into it. It gave me a glimpse good enough to make me long more than I could possibly tell you to see more. I suppose that I shall not enjoy it to the full until I see you and hold you safe and well in my arms with our dear little baby in his verses or somewhere in our vicinity. I assure you I am not jealous. It is nothing but the novelty of this thing that makes me look at him for a moment when my claims for attention rain themselves upon you. Wait until you have had him as long as you have had me and see if he wears as well as I do, and I will be content to abide the issue. Just wait until you see me and see if you will pay attention to him when I come by. If you do, I'll be mighty mad. That is all. And I'm sure you can guess that that is George Burgwyn Anderson to his wife Mildred. Camp Pickens, September 1861.
Thank you, Molly. Who has number 4? Thomas Grubb is a descendant of John Fanning Burgwyn.
This is a journal entry for Harry Burgwyn in September 1861. The sight of these poor Negroes have been hired to aid in the building of these fortifications both alarm and depress me. They have scarcely any clothes and are starved to the bone. I am told that their wages are months past due and they have no money for food or other pressing necessities. Sadness overcomes me at the sight of these poor creatures. Despite the good service, their needs must be fulfilled and they must be sent home. I will write Father about the matter forthwith.
That was Harry's diary, September 1861. Who has number 5? Wynn. Wynn is Senator John Fanning Burgwyn.
Mr. Henry King Burgwyn's great-grandson. This is a letter from Harry Burgwyn to his father in April of 1863. I've heard that you wanted to sell your cotton. I should be very reluctant to do it if I were you. Cotton will be worth $1.50 a pound after the war. If you do sell it, I think I would invest in land and Negroes. Why not buy Alveston? I suppose your cotton will bring you from $50,000 to $70,000, and Alveston could be bought for $200,000. I think Negroes will be worth $3,000 to $4,000 after the war. So that was taken the year he was killed, 2 months before he died.
That was a letter to his father from Harry to Henry in April 1863. Okay, number 6. All right, JoJo. JoJo is an outlaw, beautiful outlaw.
Thank you. I am the wife of Steve Burgwyn, son of John Griffin Burgwyn. And this is from a letter from Will Burgwyn to his father, May 1862. I can't but think that slavery has received its death blow in this war with the whole world against it.
That was number 6. Who has number 7? We have a Pennsylvania Burgwyn here, no?
I'm Sarah Burgwyn Holmes, out of the Hill Burgwyn and Gwendolyn Burgwyn Holmes clan up in Pittsburgh. This is a commentary, June 1862, from General George Burgwyn Anderson to his wife, Mildred. I know it will comfort you, my dearest, to know that I have passed through another fiery field with perfect safety. Our regiment suffered quite severely, though not near so much as at 7 Pines.
Thank you. That was number 7. Who has number 8?
I have 8.
All right. Sarah again.
I'm Sarah Gail Randolph, and this letter is from Will Burgwyn to his mother, December 1862. Every moment or two, our pickets are firing at some unlucky Yankee who chances to show his skid anywhere about, and I myself have done more firing than any other person in the picket detail, being so fortunate as to sending one to his last resting place.
Now we need number 9. That's Mr. Denny.
Yes, I'm Harmer Denny, descendant of George Burgwyn Bush, also of Hill Burgwyns in Pittsburgh, and my grandmother was Mary Blair Burgwyn. This excerpt is from the letter from General Anderson to his wife Mildred, shortly after the Battle of Malvern Hill, July 1862. We are still lying quietly in camp, and it looks very much as if the fighting is entirely over for the present. The day before yesterday, it was said to be General Lee's intention to attack the enemy again, even under the cover of their gunboats. But I am pretty well convinced now that he will not do it. In fact, they occupy so strong a position on the river and have now had so much time both to fortify and to bring up reinforcements that it seems to me it would be little short of madness to attack them, with great risk that would attend it of losing all the benefit and spoiling all the brilliancy of what we have already done. Thank you, General Anderson.
That was number 9, correct?
9.
Okay, who's 10? Nat. This is my nephew.
And now I must bid you farewell. For what will be the result of this movement, now afoot, God alone can tell. I hope to be able to do my duty to the best of my ability and leave the result to His infinite wisdom and justice. Whatever may be my own fate, I hope to be able to feel and believe that all will turn out for the best. And that's from a letter that Harry wrote to his mother while marching to Gettysburg, June 17, 1863.
That was the last letter he wrote his mother. Number 11. You have another Pittsburgh one?
Another Pittsburgh, so from the George Bush Burgwyn crowd. This is from Will Burgwyn's journal entry, July 14, 1863. Do we know who Will Burgwyn is?
William Isom Sumner.
Oh, Will. Oh. When I got there, found that I could hope no longer that my dear beloved brother, who I had just begun to appreciate for his good and noble qualities, was not taken from us by the hands of hireling mercenaries. I can hardly bear the thought of losing him, and have no one to console with me. I am indeed wretched, and to think that I yesterday telegraphed my dear mother that he was not killed.
Thank you, very nice. Number 12.
Right here. My name is Marion Allison Burgwyn from the Pittsburgh Burgwyns, originally from George William Bush Burgwyn is mine. I am also by Hill Burgwyn in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And this is a quote from Will Burgwyn's journal while he was a prisoner of war in February 1865. And this was important because Hill Burgwyn helped spring him from the prison camp. Was very unexpectedly taken out and paroled to go on exchange tomorrow through cousin Hill Burgwyn's influence. My gratitude knows no bounds.
All right, now we have number, oh, this is my dear wife, yes. Number 13. Lucky 13.
This is Margaret Mordecai Devereaux's account of her and Anna Greeno Burgwyn's reaction as the Yankees surrounded Will's Forest near Raleigh, April 1865. It was towards noon upon that fateful day that we espied a long blue line crawling serpent-like around a distant hill. Silently we watched as it coiled itself, ever drawing nearer and still nearer, until the one great reptile developed into many reptiles and took the form of men. Men in blue tramping everywhere, horsemen careening about us with no apparent object, wagons crashing through fences as though they had been made of paper. From the window at the head of the stair, nothing was visible but a sea of upturned faces. Not just by the house, but away down the slope as far as the eye could reach were men's upturned faces. I can never forget the look upon Mrs. Burgwyn's face as she whispered, "We can throw ourselves from the window." My poor craven heart might have failed me, but I am convinced that she would have done it.
And our last quote goes to Eileen, my sister-in-law, George's beautiful wife.
I'm going to read an excerpt from a poem entitled Harry, found in the scrapbook of Harry Burgwyn's younger brother, John Alveston. Before I do that, I need to say, as an Old English teacher, whether you spell your name with G-W-I-N or whether you spell it with G-W-Y-N, you probably have had the experience of people saying Burgwyn instead of Burgwyn. That hasn't come up yet. And you know, that's something that we've all lived with. I used to tell my students that Burgwyn is iambic. And if you say Burgwyn 5 times, you have iambic pentameter. That's how I would remind them that the accent went on the second syllable. So I was trying to scan this while everyone else was reading. It's not quite iambic pentameter, but the rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B. But when victory's crowns thy banner, lay aside thy heart of steel. Let the captive and the wounded naught but thy compassion feel. Bring me back a heart unhardened by the cruelties of war, a heart alive to every kindness, as in the peaceful days of yore.
Now we're going to have, what little time we have left, we're going to have open discussion. You've seen perhaps this other PowerPoint display with all the pictures that came from all over. Anybody want to talk about those, that's fine, but we have one friend of the family who would like to say something very quickly. But I think, George, interruption?
The buses will be here in 15 minutes, unfortunately, so we have to be conscious of the time. And I want to remind everyone, anyone who has memorabilia artifacts, unfortunately, we need to have those picked up very quickly, very soon. I just want to bring that to your attention, unfortunately. I don't want to make it very short about it.
Yes, time is growing short, so here you go.
I won't take much time, but it seems that a bit of my family's history has Burgwyn family history, and this is what happened to some of the Burgwyn family slaves. This is by Charlotte Brown of Philadelphia and Burlington, New Jersey. One of my earliest remembrances is a very flat, short, stumpy colored man by the name of Frisbee, who adored me and carried me about. He was my grandmother's butler and a manumitted slave from Mr. Burgwyn's place in Virginia. Frisbee had a son who was spoken of as Frisbee II and a grandson known as Frisbee III. Frisbee III did all the dirty work. He blackened the boots every morning. He washed the white marble steps of 1018 Spruce Street in Philadelphia. He cleaned the cellar doors. He carried the ashes and the coal. And in general, he did all the dirty work of the household. Frisbee was dressed as a butler for dinner, and he wore a stiff white collar and high collar. Frisbee II was dressed like him, whereas Frisbee III had a funny coat with large gold buttons on it, on a side, as I well remember. They were all black as the ace of spades. They had beautiful teeth As Mr. Burgwyn manumitted his slaves, he sent up 2 or 3 at a time. He sent to Aunt Mary Askew, a marvelous cook whose name was Emily. She was renowned all over New Jersey. With her came her daughter, a little pickaninny about a couple of years older than me, named Emmy, who followed me about and was my constant playmate until it was found necessary to send her to school, to my great despair and her great joy, for I must have treated her badly. And there was old Uncle Alex, who was a gardener at the summer home and managed to produce beautiful vegetables and many of them. So what I can conclude from this is that some Burgwyns had really delicious meals cooked by Emily and with vegetables raised by Alexander. Thanks.
All right, does anybody have any wonderful stories they'd like to tell these last 10 minutes? Any family memories?
I remember being at that Roper reunion.
1960? That was Ridley reunion.
Yeah, I'm in Ridley, yes. I remember well that picture. I know right where I was.
Tillman was in that picture too, huh? Yeah.
You were too?
Yeah, I was too, and so was George.
I'll offer one little story. This portrait, if you recognize it, is the original my great aunt has, and it's with the title of